Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we have a really special treat for you today. Bruce Ecker is here to talk to us about memory and memory reconsolidation, which is one of my favorite topics. I think this is really fascinating, and I had the pleasure of hearing Bruce live at the Psychotherapy Networker Conference in March, and he's amazing. You're in for a really big treat. And I really love his orientation to permanent transformational change. We all want that, and he knows how to do it. So we're going to dive in real quick here. I want to tell you a little bit about Bruce. He's the co-originator of Coherence Therapy. He's also the co-director of Coherence Psychology Institute. He's the co-author of Unlocking the Emotional Brain, Eliminating Symptoms at Their Roots Using Memory Reconsolidation. He also wrote the Coherence Therapy Practice Manual and Training Guide, and also the Depth-Oriented Brief Therapy, How to Be Brief When You Were Trained to Be Deep, and vice versa. He has contributed numerous innovations in experiential psychotherapy. I'm a big fan. And he's led the clinical field's emerging awareness of what memory reconsolidation research means for psychotherapy. And that's kind of what we're diving into today. Our topic and title for today is How Our Best Sessions Produce Transformational Change, Understanding Memory Consolidation for Consistent Therapeutic Effectiveness. And I'm so excited to have you, Bruce. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn this over to you to explain all the magic. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Diane. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to communicate with your circle because memory research over the last 20 years has revealed something that is of the utmost importance to psychotherapy. We now know that the brain possesses an innate natural process known as memory reconsolidation that has the remarkable ability to permanently nullify and eliminate a targeted specific piece of emotional learning or conditioning. My colleagues and I in the Coherence Psychology Institute have mapped out how an understanding of memory reconsolidation gives therapists unprecedented control over consistently producing transformational change, meaning decisive, lasting freedom from an unwanted acquired pattern. And as I'll explain, there is now good reason to trust that memory reconsolidation is the core mechanism operating whenever transformational change happens in therapy of any type. And we are sure that memory reconsolidation is going to become one of the main organizing principles of the psychotherapy field, whether it takes the field 5 years or 50 years to fully recognize the power and versatility of memory reconsolidation for psychotherapy. Now, probably all counselors and therapists sometimes have sessions that do produce transformational change. And there are distinctive markers that define transformational change and make it very clear whether or not transformational change has in fact happened. So I'll put the slides on screen now, and we will take a look at what those markers of transformational change are. Okay, this is what they are. There is complete disappearance of persistent symptoms of behavior, emotion, thought, or somatic distress. There is also disappearance of the underlying emotional activation or distressed ego state driving those symptoms. And then those changes persist effortlessly and permanently. So those are the three markers of transformational change in therapy. I often call it profound change. For example, panic attacks stop, depression is gone, compulsive behavior falls away, post-traumatic symptoms no longer get triggered, and a new quality of well-being is felt. So this is therapy at its most effective best, but transformational change is not really the norm or the expected outcome in the therapy field overall. Much of what therapists do is incremental change, degrees of symptom relief through methods that attempt to counteract symptoms or regulate the underlying emotional reactions. But the last 2 or 3 decades have seen the emergence of various systems of experiential therapy that do tend to produce transformational change. And at this point, they are in use all around the world. Now, if you are seeing transformational change regularly in your sessions with many kinds of clients, then you really don't need to learn about memory reconsolidation. I mean, let's not try to fix what isn't broken. But even though we have so many therapies of transformational change, we are still in a big quandary because these therapies that do guide transformational change have very different ways of conceptualizing it. And this fragmented situation has kept our field in something of an awkward muddle regarding the key question. How does transformational change take place? What has to happen in a therapy session to bring it about? That is arguably the single most important question for our field to answer. But we've not had any bedrock definitive answers that are independent of each particular school's methods and theoretical model. But what if the brain could speak for itself? What would the brain tell us to do to bring about transformational change? What would that description look like? What are the brain's own rules for transformational change? If we had that fundamental trans-theoretical information, guiding therapeutic breakthroughs would be much more reliable and frequent in our sessions, not to mention how it would create a unified understanding of different therapeutic systems. Remarkably, all of that is exactly what our new knowledge of memory reconsolidation gives us. We now do know the brain's own rules for transformational change. Here's one way to begin to understand what memory reconsolidation is and does. We already know that any new learning creates new neural circuits in the brain. In that sense, any new learning rewires the brain. But that new learning and new wiring does not necessarily unwire the existing underlying old learning that's driving unwanted responses. Normally, new learning and its new circuitry set up separately from existing old learning. And the new learning competes with the old learning. That's what's happening as a rule when we do therapy by working to build up preferred behaviors or states of mind that are intended to prevail over or at least regulate the client's unwanted behavior or state of mind. Working in that way to build up preferred patterns is what we call counteracting. And as a rule, it produces incremental change that flickers and is susceptible to relapse because life finds a way to re-trigger the potent old learning, which easily brushes aside the new learning, and then you're back to square one. For transformational change to occur, we need the new learning to not just create its own new circuits, but actually land directly on the circuits of the old learning maintaining the problem, and unwire and rewire those circuits. Then the result is transformational change because the old learning is profoundly unlearned and erased right down to its neural circuits, so it cannot re-trigger. And this change persists then without further efforts of any kind. That's the neural picture of transformational change, where new learning updates and replaces the neural circuits of old learning. Memory reconsolidation is precisely the brain's built-in process for getting that to happen. In fact, memory reconsolidation is the only known type of neuroplasticity that can do that, according to current neuroscience. So we now know the brain's rules and the brain's process for nullifying an existing piece of learning. And this knowledge is completely non-theoretical and independent of the various schools of psychotherapy. In a couple of minutes, we'll get into a case example that I'll use to delineate for you exactly what the client's brain needs us to do so that new learning and therapy will be put not into its own separate circuits, but in a competitive manner, but right onto and into old learning, creating transformational change. But first, in order to see how pervasively we can use memory reconsolidation in therapy, it helps to understand how pervasively our clients' problems are driven and maintained by emotional learnings. Because that's what memory reconsolidation does. It allows a specific emotional learning to be nullified. Here's a simple example of an emotional learning. Now, such learnings don't exist in words or in awareness, so they are often called implicit learnings or implicit knowledge. We learn many, many life-shaping things with no awareness of doing so. But after such implicit learnings are brought into explicit awareness and are felt emotionally and are put into words, they sound like this example. If I feel sad or hurt or scared, I'll be attacked and humiliated. So I've got to keep my feelings pushed away. That expectation of a specific form of suffering, together with that tactic for avoiding that suffering, is an emotional learning. And as a rule, emotional learnings found in therapy have that structure. Knowledge of a problem, which is some specific suffering and one's vulnerability to it, plus knowledge of a solution, which is how to avoid or end that suffering. It's a set of very specific, well-defined knowings, even though it's outside of awareness and doesn't exist in words before being verbalized. You can call that packet of acquired knowledge an implicit schema, a core belief, a mental model, an ego state, a part, emotional conditioning, a complex, whatever you call it. It's learned, it's stored in memory on neural circuits, and it's what generates so many of the behaviors, moods, emotions, thoughts, and body symptoms that show up on the surface and that people see therapists to try to get rid of. This slide lists many such symptoms that we've seen ended by using the memory reconsolidation process to unlearn and dissolve specific emotional learnings. Think of the symptoms that are generated by our earlier example of the emotional learning. If I feel sad or hurt or scared, I'll be attacked and humiliated, so I've got to keep my feelings pushed away. A person with that schema feels social anxiety and avoids intimacy, because intimacy is the worst danger zone for having vulnerable feelings that become visible. So he or she also feels very alone in life and might be depressed over that aloneness and also baffled by having all of these symptoms because he or she isn't aware of having that schema, that emotional learning. What we've observed thousands of times is that as soon as the emotional learning underlying a given symptom is dissolved and no longer exists, the symptom simply stops and disappears. Well, when a symptom disappears immediately after a specific negative emotional learning has dissolved, that's a strong indication that the cause of the symptom was that piece of emotional learning. So the observed broad effectiveness of using memory reconsolidation in therapy indicates that in the great majority of cases, the root cause of our client's symptoms is memory, emotional learnings in implicit memory. Okay, now let's bring these abstractions to life with a case example. And I'm going to use this case example to spell out the specific concrete steps of the process that triggers memory reconsolidation and nullifies the target learning. A woman I'll call Adrian described having panic attacks since her early teens. They always baffled her. She was finally coming for therapy at age 34 because both the frequency and the intensity of her panicking had increased greatly right after starting at a new job recently. It was now almost daily that she went into full panic. Her panics ended permanently after 5 sessions because I focused on doing what her brain required for unlearning what she had learned that was generating panic. There are 3 steps in the memory reconsolidation process that erases an emotional learning. And I'll describe how each step unfolded for Adrian. The first step is the reactivation of the emotional learning underlying the symptom as a conscious emotional experience of that learning. Now, in session 1, Adrian described her panic attacks, but she sure didn't describe the emotional learning underlying her panic attacks because it was completely implicit, totally outside of awareness and unknown to her conscious mind. So I too had no idea what it was. And in order to do step 1, conscious reactivation, first I had to guide her to find the implicit learning or schema underneath her panic, and then guide her into direct subjective experience and awareness of that schema. Well, that's deep experiential work in a core unresolved area of emotional vulnerability. Now, I use coherence therapy with most of my clients, and its first phase is designed exactly to do this step of finding and creating direct experience of the emotional learning underlying a given symptom. With Adrian, this discovery phase took 2 sessions, and what she became aware of was this. At her new job, for the first time in her life, she has people under her, and she is responsible for making decisions that directly affect those people. That situation is igniting an emotional learning from childhood into sheer terror. And we put that learning into words in this way. If I am I am a harmful, dangerous person. And if I do anything that directly disturbs someone, it could gravely harm them or even kill them. So I've got to stay off to the side and never have any direct effect on anyone. That had been completely unconscious. She learned it in her family in childhood. She was an only child, and the family was organized totally around her mother's extreme physical and emotional fragility. Little Adrian received clear, forceful warnings, frequently from both parents, that if she did anything that upset her mother, it could make mom collapse or even die. She once found mom collapsed on the floor in great pain and believed she had caused it. Actually, it turned out to be appendicitis. So in her primary attachment relationships, she learned that it was urgent to stay off to the side and never have any direct effect. Her new job had suddenly ruled out that safety strategy and thrust her into having very direct overt effects on several people. And this was sending her into raw panic. So now we have the target learning that will be reactivated consciously for step 1. She's now feeling and knowing that schema consciously for the first time. But her awareness of it hasn't dispelled it at all. It still feels compellingly real and true for her at this point. What did nullify that schema came next in step number 2 of the process. Let's see what step 2 is. Step 2 is the creation of an experience that sharply contradicts what the reactivated target schema expects about how the world functions. In other words, while the emotional reactivation of the target schema is occurring from step 1, step 2 is an additional concurrent experience that makes it vividly apparent that the world does not function as the schema expects. So now there is a juxtaposition of 2 experiences at once, and they contradict each other. They both feel real, but they cannot possibly both be true. This is similar to cognitive dissonance, but this is fully experiential, visceral. Step 1 plus step 2 is called a juxtaposition experience in coherence therapy. And it's what reconsolidation researchers call a mismatch experience or a prediction error experience. It's this juxtaposition of the target learning with a strongly contradictory experience that is the key to transformational change. Because when the brain registers this mismatch or juxtaposition, the neural encoding of the target learning undergoes a rapid change from a locked, consolidated, stable state to an unlocked, deconsolidated, labile state. And that is the launch of the memory reconsolidation process. And then there is a time window of several hours when the unlocked target learning is open to being re-encoded and replaced by new learning. The window then closes when the neural circuits automatically reconsolidate into a stable state in their revised form. So for step 2, I had to guide Adrienne into some experience that would strongly contradict her schema. And coherence therapy provides many different ways to do that step. The method I used with Adrienne was having life between sessions create the needed contradictory experience. Here's how I set that up to happen. I wrote the words of her schema on an index card, handed her the card, and suggested that she read it every day and have the card in front of her during her weekly telephone talk with mom. That's a mindfulness practice focused on this schema. At a minimum, that use of the index card would promote integration of her newly conscious schema into everyday awareness. And with integrated awareness of that schema, she would now recognize and register any sharply contradictory experience created by daily life between sessions, which often happens. And that's what I was especially angling for in the phone talk with her mother. In her next session, she said she had not had any panic attacks at work for nearly a week. When she described what happened during her phone talk with mom, I saw that she was describing a juxtaposition experience. Mom became tense, and with her tone of voice and phrasing had sent Adrienne the oh-so-familiar implicit message, "You're upsetting me, you're harming me, you're dangerous to me." Well, that's exactly what strongly triggers the target schema. Normally, Adrienne would just absorb that implicit message from mom with no metacognitive awareness of that message or of the schema and ego state that it was triggering her into. And like a reflex, she would shut down and withdraw into harmlessness. But this time, because she had her eyes on the index card, she was explicitly aware that mom was sending her the message, "You are being harmful and dangerous to me." And she was explicitly aware of the schema and ego state that she was now subjectively experiencing. That conscious reactivation of the target schema fulfilled step number 1. When she explained to me what happened next, I saw that it fulfilled step number 2, the experiencing of a contradictory knowing in juxtaposition with the target schema. She explained that she became lucidly aware that actually she was being very gentle and caring in how she was speaking to mom. And yet, mom was signaling to her that she's being dangerously harmful. She told me it felt very peculiar to suddenly see this big discrepancy. And she said to me, quote, "I realized it's that I've always been given the message that I'm dangerous, not that I actually do anything harmful," unquote. Right there is the contradictory knowing that she experienced concurrently with the target schema, creating the needed juxtaposition experience. Here's a slide that maps out that juxtaposition. On the left is the target learning verbalized as, "Mom always warning me about her fragility means I'm lethally dangerous and must stay mute and peripheral." On the right is the contrary knowing that lit up for her while talking to mom with her eyes on the index card, verbalized as, "Mom warns me about her fragility, even though I am actually gentle, caring, and not a danger to her." You can see that a juxtaposition experience is a fundamental disconfirmation of the target learning. In this case, it's a disconfirmation of what mom's behavior means about Adrienne. Disconfirmation is a strong degree of mismatch or prediction error. So as soon as that juxtaposition first occurs, the target schema's neural circuits rapidly deconsolidate and become open to revision by the new meaning of mom's behavior. That revision happens next in step 3 of the process through just a few repetitions of the same juxtaposition. That's step 3, and that installs the contradictory knowing to replace and eliminate the target learning. Adrienne fulfilled step 3 because right after the phone talk with her mother, she focused attention repeatedly on her fascinating new learning. I'm not harmful like I've believed all along. I'm gentle and caring. I've only been told I'm harmful. During the next week, all of the markers of transformation then became apparent. She had no more panics without any effort to avoid panic, and no more ego state of feeling she'll harm others if she expresses herself to them in a direct manner. Those markers indicate that her lifelong potent schema had dissolved and no longer existed. And then follow-up at 6 months and 2 years showed the shift had held with no effort and no relapses after 20 years of panic attacks. She also described several somatic markers. Her posture opened up. Her face opened up noticeably enough for a female friend to ask if she'd had any work done. And her handwriting changed. And as we know, the body doesn't lie. So I think it's worth mentioning, too, that by laying bare the coherent emotional learning that was generating her panic attacks, it became clear to Adrienne that her emotional learning and memory system was not malfunctioning or dysfunctioning in generating panic at work. According to what she had learned in life, that situation at work was extremely dangerous and terrifying. Her emotional learning and memory system was doing its adaptive, self-protective job properly, just as evolution had designed it and set it up to do. Emotional learnings are supposed to be very durable and tenacious. They don't fade out over time, and they aren't supposed to. The job of therapy was to decommission that specific piece of emotional learning. Now, the markers of transformational change that I've defined here are the same markers that neuroscientists use as confirmation that reconsolidation and erasure of the target learning have happened, because the brain has no other known process that can produce those markers. That's why when those markers result from any therapy sessions, it's valid now to infer that memory reconsolidation and erasure must have taken place. So the 3 steps required for that to happen must have taken place too. Of course, with some clients, complications develop, such as resistance of various kinds. And that requires extra steps and extra sessions, but this core process of 3 steps remains the same for dissolving the target emotional learning. Those 3 steps define a sequence of subjective experiences, not techniques. That's important to understand about this process. The brain doesn't care what techniques we use to create those subjective experiences. I was using coherence therapy in that example, but many different systems of psychotherapy can be used to create that crucial sequence of experiences. Coherence therapy, by design, closely follows and explicitly calls for those 3 steps. So it can have a very high consistency in producing transformational change. Let's go back to our slides. Other systems of therapy that bring about transformational change do not identify those steps in how they describe themselves, but they have methodologies that make it likely for those critical 3 steps to take place in one way or another, whether or not the therapist recognizes the steps or conceptualizes the process in this way. So, my main message here has 2 main parts. First, what you gain by understanding and conceptualizing change in this way is that then you're viewing the process of change in the same way as your client's brain does. And then you'll have breakthrough sessions much more often because you will spot the opportunities within your preferred methods for facilitating these critical experiences that are what the brain needs for transformational change. Second, we now have good reason to believe that it is always the same core process that is responsible for transformational change. And that means memory reconsolidation can serve as a powerful framework of psychotherapy integration. Case examples from 9 different therapy systems have now been published showing unambiguously that the steps of this process are embedded in the therapy process, even though 8 of those 9 therapies do not identify or label those steps in how they describe themselves. In our book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain, there are case examples from 5 different therapies: AEDP, coherence therapy, emotion-focused therapy, EMDR, and IPNB, interpersonal neurobiology. And then in the book, Memory Reconsolidation in Psychotherapy, 4 other therapy systems likewise have been shown to have the critical sequence embedded in their methods: Alexander technique, neurolinguistic programming, progressive counting, and tapping. What has seemed to be a very fragmented field of psychotherapy can be unified very usefully as well as very satisfyingly by understanding therapeutic action in terms of memory reconsolidation. Psychotherapy integration can go to a whole new level by organizing around the memory reconsolidation process. We think this knowledge of the brain's own rules for guiding transformational change is a huge, historic, field-changing development. It was 2004 that researchers discovered these rules for neural unlocking and erasure. After a century where researchers thought the brain lacked any process for erasing ingrained emotional learnings. I was just riveted by that discovery when I encountered it in 2005, and I've been teaching and writing about it ever since. I was riveted because of the huge ramifications for psychotherapy and because our 1995 book, Depth-Oriented Brief Therapy, had identified the same sequence of steps as in the therapeutic reconsolidation process, based on our observations of transformational change in our own therapy sessions. And then our book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain, came out in 2012, comprehensively mapping out how memory reconsolidation research findings translate into versatile clinical practice. My colleagues and I now predict that in the future, we won't have competing therapy systems that therapists choose between, because therapists will learn this universal innate process of the brain and will draw upon the various therapies as a rich repertoire of different ways to facilitate this core process with a given client. Now, I have one more case example for you that I think will be pretty interesting. In this next case example, the problem is anger. The client here is a woman in her early 50s, and I'll call her Norina. She described a feeling of angry resentment that she said had frequently gripped her and ruled her behavior for as long as she could remember. For example, over the years, her simmering angry mood had activated often toward her husband, sometimes for prolonged periods. They'd been married 28 years, and her anger was a big factor in the chronic tension between them. So what I'll do once again is describe how the steps of the memory reconsolidation process unfolded and freed Norina from the grip of that anger. This slide again shows the 3 steps of the schema nullification process. And I'm going to embellish this slide by including in it some obvious things that were covered in our first case example earlier. Namely, there are 3 things you first need to find out before you can guide these 3 steps of the core process. And those things are, you need to know specifically what are the unwanted behaviors, emotions, thoughts, or body sensations that the client wants ended. You then need to find out the makeup of the emotional learning or schema underlying and driving those unwanted features. And you need to then find out how to put the client in touch with vividly real feeling personal knowledge that contradicts what that schema knows. I covered each of those setup steps or prep steps in the previous case example of Adrian's panic attacks. And now I'm just making these prep steps explicit parts of the map. And I also covered the very last step where we look for the markers of transformational change as verification that schema erasure or nullification has occurred. That's step V for verification. So that's the process fully spelled out as a general map for therapists for using memory reconsolidation to dispel any unwanted pattern that's based in emotional learning. And we call it the therapeutic reconsolidation process. Okay, let's walk through how those steps unfolded with Norina. Prep step A, symptom identification, was straightforward up to a point. Her reaction of anger and resentment was easy for her to name, but it had happened in so many different situations across the decades that she could not define what happens that triggers that anger. She did say that the anger went all the way back to her childhood. So as I began prep step B, the discovery work, I knew we were looking for something that she had learned at a young age, as is so often the case. Now, in step B, I was searching for the emotional learning that was driving this angry resentment in so many different situations for a lifetime. What had she learned and how had she learned it? In order to guide her attention and awareness into that area of implicit learning, whatever it was, I said to her, just see what comes to mind when I ask you this question. In your whole life, what is it that you resent the most? What sprang up in response to that was something she was already well aware of. It was her childhood trauma of being sexually molested by her grandfather on a number of different occasions starting at age 6. She had already had extensive therapy for that long ago, and of course, obviously it makes sense that a person would feel angry resentment about suffering such an ordeal of violation and betrayal. And yet, not every person who has suffered sexual molestation in childhood has this kind of dominant mood of angry resentment for the next 4 decades, as Norina had. Well, that means there was something unique and specific to her emotional learnings that was generating that anger and was critical to bring into awareness here. The unique specificity of each person's emotional learnings is a major emphasis in coherence therapy. So next, I asked her gently, what is it that you suffered in that ordeal that you resent more than anything else about it? That question put her attention onto her implicit knowledge to an entirely new degree. Her previous therapy had not zeroed in that way. What is it that you suffered in that ordeal that you resent more than anything else about it? As she sat there looking into that, her eyes were blinking. And then she said, it feels like even more than resenting my grandfather, I resent the whole world or life itself. So next I asked, what can you see about why you resent life itself? In order to just continue this flow from implicit knowing into explicit knowing. And what came into awareness next was something that had never before entered her conscious thinking as an adult. She said, it's that the world is just too unfair to make this happen to me and to no one else. Well, that really surprised me. She then explained that when this ordeal began as a little girl, she just took it to be something that was happening only to her and not to anyone else in the world. That was just how it seemed. Such a thing seemed not to exist anywhere else. She had never heard of it. Certainly no one ever spoke of it. Yet it was happening to her, and it was huge. It just filled her world. So in all innocence, she construed that it was happening only to her. That attribution of meaning, that single implicit construct that it was happening only to her, led her in turn to view the world as monstrously and unforgivably cruel and unfair. So she was indeed profoundly angry and resentful at life. And that was the emotional learning I was looking for. This horrible ordeal happened only to me, and that means the world is unforgivably cruel and unfair. Now, hearing this from her, I immediately understood that forever after, whenever anything felt unfair and arbitrary, of course, it re-triggered that same deep anger and resentment, but without awareness of the source of that anger. Well, arbitrary, unfair things happen fairly often in life and in a marriage. So she was often swept up into that resentful anger throughout her life. And now, for the very first time, her emotional learning that the world had been brutally unfair to her alone had come into her conscious foreground awareness. She was now both feeling and verbalizing that model of the world. So step B is done, and she's fully aware of the discovered target schema. At this point, that schema still feels real and true to her. We've learned that it's not explicit awareness, it's not integrated awareness that dissolves emotional schemas by itself. It's juxtaposition experiences, and that had not happened yet. Steps 1, 2, and 3 had not happened yet. She felt my empathy, she felt safe with me, she trusted me, and we had a good working alliance. But no matter how good the client-therapist relationship factors are, schemas don't dissolve until juxtaposition experiences happen. That's what we've observed again and again. And I think it's probably very clear to you that in this case, a positive experience of empathy from a therapist could not possibly disconfirm a target schema that's all about how brutally, cruelly unfair life is because of what happened to her at 6. So disconfirmation is going to have to be found elsewhere than in the client-therapist relationship for this schema. And that's what needs to happen next, finding a disconfirmation of that schema. Step B has revealed this anger-generating schema-specific makeup, so now that makes it possible to do step C and find some strong knowing that can disconfirm and nullify this schema. Now, before I describe how I carried out step C with her, I want to briefly mention something that I feel is very important. The sexual molestation by her grandfather was traumatic, obviously. It was both acute incident trauma and complex attachment trauma all at once. And yet, what has Norina identified as being the worst of it? The worst of it, she said, is not the physical sensations and perceptions and emotions in the ordeal, and not even the personal betrayal by her grandfather. The worst of it is what that ordeal means about the kind of world it is and the cruel, unjust character of life itself. Her attributed meanings are the worst of it and are what's been making her so prone to seethe with anger and resentment whenever anything unfair happens to her. I think it's vitally important for therapists to understand that traumatic memory is made up of not only the original raw data of perceptions and sensations and emotions, But just as importantly, and in many cases more importantly, it's also made up of the meanings and models formed and learned in those traumatic ordeals. Put in terms of the science of learning and memory, traumatic memory is made up of both the episodic memory of the event particulars, plus what researchers call semantic memory, consisting of meanings, models, beliefs, rules, and strategies that formed based on the event particulars. Okay, that's what I wanted to point out about traumatic memory. And now back to Noreena's unfolding therapeutic reconsolidation process. It's time to work on finding a vivid contradictory knowing, namely a vivid knowing that the world is not so cruelly unfair as she took it to be. That is step C, and I used a different method for this step than I did with Adrienne for her panic attacks. It turns out that in at least half of all cases, the client already possesses vivid contradictory knowledge, but it has never juxtaposed with the target learning because the target learning has been fully implicit and unconscious, and so has been sealed off from encountering any contradictory knowledge. Well, as soon as I learned what Noreena's symptom-generating schema was, it happened only to me, immediately I figured that it's a pretty sure thing that her conscious adult understandings included the vivid knowledge that it didn't happen only to her. So right away, my plan was to guide her into accessing the contrary knowing that I figured she already possessed. Arriving at that plan for how to access a specific contradictory knowledge completed prep step C. So now steps A, B, and C were done, and I could move right into guiding the core transformation sequence, steps 1, 2, and 3. Noreena was still sitting there in a state of conscious reactivation of, it happened only to me. She's directly feeling and verbalizing the subjective realness of, it happened only to me. So step 1, target schema reactivation, was already in effect. For step 2, I needed to evoke the contradictory knowing that I was sure she already possessed. The knowledge, it didn't happen only to me, it happened to many, many other children too. Life did not single me out for this. Well, in order to elicit that contrary knowing so that it would really light up as her own lucid knowing, what I did was very simple and easy. I simply asked her to assert the target learning out loud. You'll see why in a moment. I said simply, please say it to me. It happened only to me. She said out loud, it happened only to me. And again, it simply felt true. Now, here comes the key moment. I asked her to please say it again. Can you sense what's going to happen now? When she said it this time, it was heard by her entire adult knowledge network too. And immediately her facial expression changed into a look of puzzlement. If contradictory knowledge is already there in the client's possession, simply asserting the target learning tends to evoke that contradictory knowledge. That happens because the brain has a built-in detector of any mismatch between whatever item is the focus of attention and everything else that one knows about the world. Just like in those moments when an acquaintance shows up with a changed hairstyle or a shaved mustache, and you feel that something's different before you can identify cognitively what's different. That's your brain's mismatch detector operating. The puzzled look on Noreena's face meant that she was now feeling the first sensation of mismatch. So I invited her to say another repetition of, it happened only to me. This time, her contradictory knowledge really lit up and her eyes began darting around the room, and she realized front and center that it most certainly had not happened only to her. So this is the moment that to the client feels like, wait a minute, hold everything. On her face now was a look of real surprise, and after a few seconds, she softly said, quote, "Oh my God, I really thought it happened just to me, but it happens everywhere. It's a part of life everywhere. It's an ugly part of life, but it keeps happening to girls and boys too, all the time, everywhere. I wasn't singled out, unquote. So that was step 2. And those were the initial moments of juxtaposition, step 1 plus step 2. She's now experiencing the target learning and the contrary knowing both at once. The neural circuits of the target learning are now unlocking, deconsolidating, destabilizing, according to Reconsolidation research. We hovered right there for several minutes. She kept giving amazed attention to this fresh realization, which repeated the juxtaposition each time. And in addition, with empathy, I explicitly reviewed both her old belief and her new realization in order to repeat the juxtaposition experience a couple more times just by empathically reviewing it. And that accomplished step 3 of the process. If the process was successful, in those few minutes, her childhood learning that she had been cruelly singled out by life had been unlearned, dissolved, and erased. Erasure means that it happened only to me would no longer feel real or true in any part of herself or in any memory network. And without that construct that life had singled her out for such suffering, there would be no view of life as being hideously unfair to her, and in turn, no more generating of angry resentment over that. The dissolution would ripple through that whole linkage. That's how emotional unlearning operates. So I was very eager to hear what she would report in her next session, which was 1 month later. I started that session by asking whether she had noticed any subsequent effects of the previous session's work. So this was now my pursuit of step V, verification. Here is what she said, and these are her exact words. I've been angry and resentful my whole life. It's like something has just turned to dust. It's not alive anymore. Before, something felt like cords and cables strangling me. I feel so freed up, unquote. Over the next couple of months, she described a new ease and friendliness and warmth between her and her husband. 8 months later, they had a particularly stressful month of not being emotionally in sync very well with each other during struggles with the extended family. However, Norina said, it was rough, but I haven't felt any resentment towards him. So I grabbed this opportunity to elicit more follow-up, and I said to her, can I check with you about the work we did on that core belief, it happened only to me? I'm wondering whether or not the shift that you initially described has held. And she said, and again, these are her exact words, my resentment had been relentless. Even with all these troubles, that anger is not taking over. Then a few moments later, she said, most of the time, I'm in a wonderful, energized, peaceful state. That's the way I would describe it, even with all these troubles, unquote. Well, I had no idea she was now feeling wonderful most of the time. You know, clients come in and sit down and talk about the problems. I asked because I wanted to do step V and know whether the markers of transformational change were well established and holding from that previous work. And they sure were. Now, Norina had erased what she had learned from certain events and experiences, but this did not impair her episodic memory, her autobiographical memory of those events and experiences. She still remembers what she experienced and suffered with her grandfather. The event memory is what it is. It's not erased. What's erased by the memory reconsolidation process are the schemas, the meanings and models and personal rules that people form and learn from the events. When meanings and models change, then emotions and behaviors change in turn, because emotions and behaviors arise from and express meanings and models. So I'll sum up now and finish by saying this. I've been describing how we approach psychotherapy through an understanding of emotional learning and unlearning. I've described the structure and operation of emotional learnings and how profound unlearning takes place through the memory reconsolidation process. We call this overall paradigm the emotional coherence framework. If you find this framework useful and appealing, it is fully spelled out in our book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain. And if coherence therapy interests you, the website coherencetherapy.org has many learning resources, including videos and the Coherence Therapy Practice Manual. Thank you.
So Bruce, thank you. That was really elucidating and so clarifying for how all these different therapeutic wisdoms can come together and be synthesized sort of with a common goal, lasting transformational change. But you've made it very precise and clear and understandable for all of our therapists out there, and me too, on how we've been kind of doing somewhat similar things, but without near the precision or without really understanding the unlearning process, I think, as clearly as you've elucidated it. So in the DARE model, it basically means dynamic attachment repatterning experience. A lot of times we use these emotional corrective experiences against the original painful experience, but so often that's just arising in the session, and maybe we're not getting completely to the targeted schema so beautifully as you described, and working with the panic, and then in the first example, and then working with anger and resentment related to sexual abuse so beautifully in the second example. And I love it that you've brought so much clarity and commonality to so many bodies of work out there, and yet it's a very unique contribution of really precisely understanding the neuroscience, the neuroplasticity, so much that's exploded in the last 10 years, and really seeing how we can create effective and lasting transformational change. Really so beautiful. I was so excited to hear you at the Networker, and it's even more so nice to have this one-on-one time with you today. Really feels like a big blessing to all of us. And I wanted to mention too, I think this understanding of really getting clear on the target schema, and that takes some time to unearth. You really made that clear in the second example, that may take some time to really get clear exactly what that is, because the client's not going to come in and just say it, right? It's an implicit memory, but it's guiding so much of the meanings and models, and like you said, those shuffle right into the emotional experiences and behaviors. So I think this is a huge contribution, and I'm just so happy we're able to share this with our whole therapy mastermind circle. So thank you. Really,
You're welcome.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Really beautiful. And so I want to make sure that our folks have some time to ask some questions, and we're going to kind of transfer you over into our participants being able to ask you what's been on their mind. I'm sure you've planted a lot of seeds for many deep thoughts about people's personal experience as well as their professional experience. And it just speaks so loudly of how the brain works and how we can work with the design, and how we are really designed to be transformative, to transform our lives and to heal. So I find it a very hopeful and empowering message to all of us as therapists in a really practical way, and then what we can share with our clients. So
yes, it is. Great.
I'm going to turn you over. So thanks so much.
Well, I'm ready to take questions. And in order to submit your questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, not the chat button. The Q&A button is how to submit your questions. And indeed, they are showing up for me here. Let me move a bit of this window around, and here we go. All right, first question I have is, how does memory reconsolidation unfold if, one, the original emotional learning was pre-verbal? Great question. Two, the learning was prenatal, if you consider that possible. Three, the client seems to have always had a temperamental sensitivity and volatility, such as seems the case in bipolar disorder, BPD. All right, boy, those are great questions and challenging questions. I'll do my best with them. I want to make sure there's time for everybody who has questions if possible, and I could easily get on a roll with questions that are this juicy. So I'll try to be succinct. All right, first, how does memory reconsolidation unfold if the original learning was pre-verbal? Yes, of course, that happens often. There are many techniques that can be used to feel into we're talking now about the discovery process, or step B, right? Steps A and B of the therapeutic reconsolidation process. You start with a definition, a clarification of what to consider the unwanted patterns, the symptoms. And from there, you carry out retrieval or discovery into what are the existing emotional learnings that are generating and maintaining those specific symptoms. If those learnings were formed pre-verbally, then of course that retrieval process is somewhat more challenging. What is needed, I think, for success is some degree of, shall we call it, conviction on the part of the therapist, that even though the emotional learnings are nonverbal, they are nevertheless well defined and findable and can be put into words that the client will feel uh, is an emotional truth, not just a conceptualization. In fact, even emotional learnings that were formed after the client could speak and conceptualize, those also exist non-verbally. The emotional learnings retrieved in the two examples I gave in the presentation did not exist in words before I guided the clients to access them and experience them and find words. I often feel as I'm doing the retrieval work that we are we are putting clothing on an invisible person to make that person visible. The person being the person who knows, who is those emotional learnings. The words make the emotional learning quite visible and known to the conscious mind. At that point, the client knows what she knows. So it's always the case that we're trying to feel into it, have guide direct experience of emotional learnings that don't exist in words. So if uh, uh, the essence of the process really doesn't change fundamentally if the original learnings occurred pre-verbally. Now, one always has to find specific methods or interventions or techniques to do the work. Each of us therapists has our own repertoire of methods that we find familiar and effective. For emotional learnings that are pre-verbal, one method that I find to be effective is either somewhat similar to focusing, where you have the client just feel the uh, the 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 um, the emotional knowledge in the scene where the symptom happens, right? Let's say the experience is one of oh, let's make something up. Uh, Feeling like expecting abandonment or expecting deprivation or expecting no response to an expression of need. Okay? If that's the symptom, you have the client pay attention to what's going on inside in a situation where that experience is happening. And you deepen the client by guiding attention into the body, into what's present emotionally, affectively. Um, you can have the client uh, 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 find words to express what is there wordlessly. And even pre-verbal learnings can be cast into words and become familiar to the client in that way. For example, a client will say, I don't expect there to be any caring about what I need, and it's terrifying me. I expect to be left all alone, unhelped, desperate, and helpless. And in such ways, even pre-verbal learnings can come into direct awareness and be present in the room for direct work. I could keep going on that, but let's make sure that I get to parts 2 and 3 of this question. What if the learning was prenatal? Really, the same answer, the same answer. By feeling into the work. Some forms of inner child work can work really well for this. For the pre-verbal case, the client can picture the infant self in a crib and be standing next to that baby while the baby is in the distress, and interact with the baby tenderly and intimately and feel what the baby's needs are and feel what the baby's distress is about, and comfort that baby and give caring understanding for specifically what the distress and the emotional learnings are about. The last part of that question was about temperamental sensitivity. Yes, temperament is often a sizable factor. Not all patterns, unwanted patterns, are based in emotional learning. Some are based in inborn temperament. However, the emotional learnings are what exacerbate and inflame and create reactions that are amplified by the temperament. So finding the emotional learnings that are uh, um, uh, uh, eliciting temperamental reactions is still necessary. In my experience, I don't think I've ever uh, worked with a client where it emerged that there were no emotional learnings or schemas emerged when we examined the situations where the unwanted patterns happen. Even when temperament seems to be a sizable component driving responses, always there are very specific emotional learnings or schemas operating too. So the work still consists of bringing into awareness what was suffered originally and what was learned from that suffering that gets re-triggered in present situations, and unlearning those expectations of the suffering in the present. I hope that's at least a beginning of an answer to those questions. Next question. I want to know when the next in-person training is for this approach in the Bay Area, California. Good question. I want to know that too. My colleagues in the Coherent Psychology Institute and I are aware that we need to schedule an introductory training here in the Bay Area, where I am. And we're working on scheduling that. Our website has a page that lists all scheduled workshops. So as soon as we figure out when to hold that workshop, it'll be there on the page. I will mention that our next in-person workshop is in New York City in November. It's an intermediate level training. And so there's a prerequisite for familiarity with the entire methodology, even if that's only, say, 3 months of having studied some of our writings and trying these methods and this framework with your own clients for 3 months. That would be enough of a prerequisite for you to attend the New York City Intermediate Workshop in November. Next question. I use many processes, including guided imagery and voice dialogue, collected in the clear beliefs process. We use an imagined experience that serves as the contradictory experience. For example, having the client imagine standing up to their aggressive parent. Do you see this imaginative contradiction equally valid to the real world contradiction? It certainly works for my clients and for my students' clients, as evidenced by similar, quote, miraculous results as in your case. Yes, imaginal work is fully as effective as physical, real-life experiences to create contradictory knowledge. In fact, there is research, rigorous research, that shows that the subcortical emotional brain responds to imagined experiences almost identically as it does to external, physically perceived experiences. And so, yeah, I make heavy use of imaginal work in my sessions. It's very effective. And so, yeah, if you're seeing, as you say you are here, to this questioner, the essentially step V of the therapeutic reconsolidation process, those markers of transformational change. The old emotional reaction or ego state is no longer triggered in the same situations where it always was, and the symptoms produced by that emotional self state or ego state no longer occur, and that change persists permanently and effortlessly with no more measures or methods to hold it in place, then you are successfully facilitating this process with those methods. Yeah, very good. Great. Next question. This is a comment. So helpful. Thank you for your insight. Well, thank you very much. And please, if you do have comments, I certainly welcome your comments as well as your questions. And we have still about 20 minutes of time scheduled left for your questions and comments. So anything else you want to send in, there's plenty of time for that by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Let me check for any further. No, there's nothing more right now. Let's see. The coherencetherapy.org website, oh, that's a synchronicity. As I was about to tell you about the website, somebody asked, what is your website, right at that moment. The website is coherencetherapy.org. And there are many, many resources there for learning more about this framework, learning more about both memory reconsolidation and learning more about coherence therapy, which is our clinical methodology for carrying out the therapeutic reconsolidation process. As I mentioned in the presentation, coherence therapy really consists entirely of those steps of the therapeutic reconsolidation process. So in other words, we designed and created therapy that is aimed at the most focused, efficient way to move through those steps with each client. It's a very unique journey with each client, as I'm sure you could see by thinking of the two different examples I gave in the presentation. Even though you're moving through the same series of steps, the content that each of those steps elicits and presents for different clients is completely original. All right, next question. Do we know anything about genetic underpinnings of memory and how the reconsolidation process works for different individuals? I'm not sure I understand that question, but I can say from my experience of, about 30 years of working in this way, at least no, more like 25 years, I've carried out this process with thousands of different clients. So that spans a wide range of genetic underpinnings. And it's rare that I have a client for whom this process cannot be facilitated to completion, at least for some of their schemas, some of their emotional learnings. So it seems very fundamental. And in fact, the neuroscience researchers have confirmed the existence of the process and the same patterns of operation of the process across widely different species, from worms up through higher organisms, all the way to humans, quite a few different species. So it seems it's what's called a conserved type of neuroplasticity, conserved across phyla, across species and phyla. So this was an extremely successful development in evolution, so much so that it has been preserved through hundreds of millions of years of evolution. So I think that's an indication that it operates in pretty much the same way across different human beings within the same species. All right, next question. Somatic therapies focus on the role of discharge as well as meaning shifts. Is there an emphasis on any need for such discharge or physical/emotional release in coherence therapy, as well as cognitive change? Yeah, in the following sense. But first, I want to say that what's being referred to as cognitive change isn't only cognitive change. As I hope I made clear in the two examples in the presentation, what winds up verbalized and might look like cognitive work is actually a directly, affectively, and somatically felt emotional truth that it doesn't exist in words in its in its native form in memory. These are emotional learnings. They exist in the subcortical brain largely, and they don't exist in words. We find words that the client feels are an accurate, adequate representation of the emotional learning. But it's not cognitive work. It's very experiential work, and it's whole body involvement in the experiential work in coherence therapy. So the discharge, when the emotional learning involves significant suppression, many people's emotional learnings have been suppressed, and traumatic memory often involves a great deal of suppression of both the original experience as an episodic memory, as well as suppression of the schemas formed and the emotions involved. And we don't have to be even talking about big T traumatic memory for this to be the case. Just think of, for example, a situation where someone's been mistreated by a sibling very consistently throughout his or her life. Hundreds of instances of harsh, mean mistreatment. And there can be an accumulation of anger that is so significant that the person has that anger largely suppressed. So yes, desuppression is often a crucial part of the work. And in my experience, I find that the desuppression seems to be what's necessary as, how to put it, the suppressed state blocks access to the schema, to the emotional learning or the emotional truth. Desuppression involves, of course, working with the client in small enough steps, as we say, to tolerate contact with the material and to tolerate the release, the allowing the material, whether it's emotion or knowings. Sometimes it's knowings that are as urgent to suppress as emotions. The desuppression then allows the person to access the emotional learnings. If anything is so threatening or intense that it has to be suppressed, then the linked emotional learnings likewise are inaccessible. So the desuppression work is often a crucial piece that allows the full package of emotional learning to also be retrieved into awareness. Because it's that schema, it's the emotional learnings, that the models of reality, the meanings, the rules, the adaptive tactics that were learned as necessary, that are the actual direct target of change in this whole framework. Next question. Would you please share how you handle resistance in the process of locating the schema? Good question, very important question. Resistance can occur at any stage in the process. It can occur during the retrieval work, step B, and even in some cases, I know I've had clients where resistance in the form of dissociation might happen even in step A, just looking closely at the situations where the symptom or the unwanted responses or patterns occur. I've had clients where even those first gentle steps of tell me about what you're experiencing when the problem happens. And already, I remember one woman who looked at me when I asked that question and said, I have to tell you that I'm on the ceiling already. And she was. That was too big a step for her. But immediately I learned, oh, okay, there's very intense material here that staying in the window of tolerance is going to take much smaller steps of work. So I began to recalibrate immediately with her. So resistance can start right at the start. And the retrieval work can meet resistance even after the schema has been brought into awareness and is now explicit and conscious in the sessions. There can be resistance to integrating that schema. Staying in touch with it between sessions is sometimes where the resistance shows up. Or even when the schema is fully integrated, And the client is now quite familiar with having this piece of emotional learning um, uh, in day-to-day life as an emotional truth, not just a cognitive insight. Then when we finally find a contradictory knowing and guide juxtaposition experiences that seem to be well-formed juxtaposition experiences in the session, there can be resistance that sets in at that point, because it turns out that this juxtaposition isn't a mechanical process. The dissolution, the disconfirmation of the schema is not a mechanical process. It's allowed by the client's mind and brain only if all anticipated consequences of the nullification of the schema feel workable. And in many cases, the client's emotional learning and memory system foresees some way in which dissolution of the schema is going to bring something that doesn't feel okay or workable, something that feels threatening or too distressing in its own way. So when we see that the schema remains in force, even after well-guided juxtaposition experiences, that's, you'd think that ought to make a dent in the schema, but nothing changes, that's your beginning indication that now there's resistance to the transformational process, the juxtaposition process. Now, the question is, how do we work with resistance, whatever the stage it is when it forms? In coherence therapy, as soon as we recognize that resistance is occurring, we temporarily regard the resistance as the symptom. We never use the word symptom with clients, but now that's the focus of change. We now begin the entire process focusing on the resistance of the symptom. In other words, we assume that the symptom is coherent. In other words, the symptom of resistance, is emotionally necessary in some way that needs to be compassionately and empathically understood, respected, and brought into explicit recognition in the same way that any other symptom is handled in coherence therapy. So we, in other words, guide the client into recognition that whatever step of work was being invited that met resistance is meeting a no, that there's a no to it, that something is not workable about going ahead with that step, whether it's allowing the discovery work or staying in touch with the material between sessions, or allowing the schema to dissolve in the final stages of the work. And we work to bring out what is the anticipated unworkable result of that step of work that's meeting resistance. That is made very explicit and is then worked with in the same way as any other symptom, as I said. In other words, there's a schema. There are certain well-defined expectations. There's a model of what the client can tolerate. For example, desuppression work, when the material is too intense and is in a state of suppression, the desuppression work can meet resistance. The client expects desuppression to be overwhelming or shattering in some way. And so when the work is then slowed down and conducted in small enough steps that the client can actually tolerate each next piece of desuppression of material, patiently persisted with across as many sessions as it takes for sizable and then full desuppression to occur, and then the client's attention is called to the original expectation that I couldn't handle letting myself feel and know that stuff, and now I see that I can and have the strength to contact that material. That in itself is often a powerful therapeutic step for people. The recognition that that their mind and brain have the strength and the integrity to tolerate facing what seemed uh, uh, shattering and unfaceable is itself a big piece of therapy that changes the client's sense of herself or himself in a very valuable way. Even before the material that has been desuppressed is now worked with and brought to transformation itself subsequently. All right, I'll move on to the next question. I hope I addressed that sufficiently. Are there clients you would recommend not using this process with? Well, certainly always safety comes first. So we all know there are situations and types of clients, types of clinical situation where stability is in jeopardy. For example, somebody recovering from addiction who's in certain stages of fragility, doing in-depth work is sometimes not advisable, counterindicated because of possible destabilization. That has to be very carefully managed, of course. There are clients, of course, who absolutely declare, I don't want to do in-depth work. I don't want to look at my history. I don't want to get in touch with anything deep. I just want you to tell me how to stop having behavior X happen or mood X. I respect the client's wishes. I might explore that condition to some degree, find out how come, see if it's shiftable or not. But if the client really has that position, then I'll respect that, and I wouldn't try to do in-depth work with somebody who insists they don't want to do that. Of course, there are clients who are at the more severe end of the spectrum of character rigidities, or character, what is widely referred to in our field as personality disorder, character disorder, narcissistic or borderline or similar conditions. At the more severe end of the spectrum, these are people who, at least for the time being, for all practical purposes, are so powerfully organized around not facing and accessing inner underlying emotional truth, emotional learnings, that for all practical purposes, it's just not possible to carry out this kind of process. That's another category. In our book, Unlocking the Emotional Brain, I think it's around page 28, 26, somewhere there, we have a list of quite an extensive list of the conditions for which this framework, this approach is counterindicated. Next question, we have a few minutes left. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is really the only, quote, evidence-based therapy that is accepted here in Australia. But if there can't be any real transformational change without understanding or revealing the emotional learning that underpins the unwanted behaviors, parentheses, and the brain is designed to detect mismatches even before cognitive recognition takes place, close parentheses, why are these methods you're discussing still so undervalued in, quote, conventional therapy? That's a question whose answer has many, many parts. Yes. There are many progressive, experiential, focused, in-depth therapies that are very effective and deserve widespread recognition and use. And why the therapy field has the inertia that it does, there's a lot of factors to that, and I don't think I can even begin to try to get into it. But the question seems to be saying that that the questioner wishes that these kinds of approaches would have more prominence and acceptance. And I appreciate that. Thank you very much for that implicit message. Well, I think the time is up at that point. So I want to honor the time commitment by ending right here. Thank you all very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much. And those of you who find this approach interesting, I hope to be in contact with you and seeing you and communicating with you in one form or another in the future. Thanks. Bye-bye.
So Bruce, that was a really lively question and answer. I'm sure that I appreciated your answers to some of the specifics that people brought up. And I know we've got the wheels turning. This is going to continue to be an important conversation for a long time. So I, again, want to thank you so much. And I know you do live trainings across the country. People can check out your website. Would the best one be the coherencetherapy.org for any events you have going on?
Yes, it would.
Okay, so let's keep up with Bruce, and thanks for being a member of our, we call it the Transformation Tribe, so even more relevant with the title of your talk today. And thank you. This has been so enriching for all of us. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay, take care. Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye. And thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you for paying attention and being involved and listening to this, whether you're listening to it live or in the recordings. We're so glad to share this with all of you. Thanks everybody. Take care.